There was one name Johnny Carson never allowed on his show. Not in the monologue. Not in the guest interviews. Not even on the cue cards Doc Severinsen held up during commercial breaks. For 30 years, that name lived in a silence so deliberate, so carefully maintained, that even the writers knew better than to suggest it. But on October 12, 1989, Ed McMahon said it. And the moment those syllables left his mouth, something inside Johnny Carson shattered in front of 15 million viewers. The studio lights dimmed slightly as they always did during the monologue. Johnny stood behind his desk, his hands clasped in that familiar way, his timing perfect as always. The audience was warm, responsive. Ed sat to his left, chuckling at the setup Johnny was building. It was a Thursday night, unremarkable in every way except for what was about to happen. Johnny had just finished a joke about politicians when Ed, trying to add to the bit, leaned forward with that signature laugh and said, "You know who would have loved that joke, Johnny? Your old man would have been." And then he said the name. Johnny Carson stopped mid-breath. The smile on his face didn't fade, it froze. His eyes, which had been dancing with comic energy just a second before, went completely still. The audience didn't know what was happening. Neither did Ed. Not yet. But anyone watching Johnny's face closely enough could see it. A door had just opened that had been locked for decades. And behind that door was something Johnny Carson had spent his entire adult life trying to forget. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. To understand what happened that night, you have to go back to 1962. Johnny Carson was 36 years old, newly divorced, and about to take over The Tonight Show from Jack Paar. He was ambitious, sharp, and terrified. His father, Homer Carson, had driven out from Nebraska to see his son's first week in New York. Johnny hadn't invited him. Homer just showed up. That was the kind of man he was, unannounced, uninvited, and always carrying the weight of disappointment. Homer Carson was a man who believed success was measured in soil and livestock, not television ratings. He'd never understood his son. Never laughed at his jokes. Never told him he was proud. The week Homer spent in New York, he sat in the back of the studio during tapings, arms crossed, expressionless. After the show, he'd meet Johnny backstage and say things like, "That was fine, I suppose," or, "You missed a couple beats in the second segment." On the last night of his visit, Johnny took his father to dinner at a steakhouse near Rockefeller Center. It was supposed to be a moment of reconciliation. Instead, it became the final conversation they would ever have. Homer looked at his son across the table and said, "You know, John, I still don't understand why you gave up a decent job to do this." Johnny never spoke to his father again. Not at Christmas. Not at his mother's funeral 6 years later. And when Homer Carson died in 1983, Johnny didn't attend the service. He was taping a show that day. The band played. The audience laughed. And Johnny smiled through every second of it, just like he always did. That name, Homer Carson, became a ghost. Johnny's writers were told never to reference it. His producers kept it off limits. Even Ed McMahon, his closest friend and most loyal sidekick for nearly 3 decades, knew there were certain doors you didn't open with Johnny. And the biggest one had his father's name written on it. But on that October night in 1989, Ed forgot. Or maybe he thought enough time had passed. Either way, the moment the name left his lips, Johnny Carson froze. The entire studio froze. Ed realized his mistake instantly. His smile faltered. He glanced at Johnny, whose face had gone pale under the studio lights. The audience, sensing something was wrong, stopped laughing. The silence wasn't the good kind, the kind that comes before a punchline. It was the heavy, suffocating kind that happens when something deeply private suddenly becomes public. Johnny's hand moved slowly to the edge of his desk. He gripped it, steadying himself. For a man who had spent 30 years mastering the art of control, this was the closest he'd ever come to losing it on air. His jaw tightened. He looked down at the desk, then back up at Ed, and for just a moment, the mask slipped. The audience saw something they'd never seen before: Johnny Carson, vulnerable and raw. Doc Severinsen, watching from the bandstand, lifted his hand to signal the orchestra. He wasn't sure if he should fill the silence with music or let it breathe. The cameras stayed locked on Johnny's face. The director in the booth didn't cut away. Everyone knew they were witnessing something rare and unrehearsable. Ed leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Johnny, Johnny raised his hand, stopping him. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. Like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it on television. "It's okay, Ed." Those 3 words hung in the air like a confession. The audience didn't applaud. They didn't react at all. They just watched as Johnny Carson, the man who had made them laugh for 3 decades, stood there and let himself be human for the first time. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. Johnny turned away from Ed, his hands still gripping the edge of the desk. He looked out at the audience, and for a moment, it seemed like he might say something more. But he didn't. He just stood there, eyes scanning the rows of faces staring back at him, waiting for him to tell them it was all part of the act. Waiting for the punchline that would never come. Behind him, the curtains swayed slightly in the air conditioning. The lights overhead buzzed faintly. The studio, which moments ago had been alive with laughter, now felt like a cathedral, silent, reverent, and holding its breath. Ed McMahon sat frozen in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his face etched with regret. He had been Johnny's sidekick since 1962, the man who laughed at every joke, set up every bit, and knew when to speak and when to stay silent. But tonight, he had crossed the one line Johnny had drawn in permanent ink. Johnny finally moved. He walked slowly around the desk, his steps deliberate, and sat down in his chair. He picked up a pen from the desk, the same pen he always fidgeted with during interviews, and turned it over in his fingers. The cameras stayed on him. The director didn't cut to commercial. Everyone knew this moment couldn't be interrupted. "You know," Johnny said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual showman polish, "there are some things you bury because they're too sharp to hold." The audience didn't react. They didn't know if they should. Ed's eyes were locked on Johnny, his face pale under the lights. Johnny looked down at the pen in his hands, then back up at the audience. "My father never understood what I did. He never laughed at a single joke I told. Not one. And I spent a long time trying to make him laugh. Trying to make him proud." He paused, his jaw tightening. "And then I stopped trying." The silence in the studio was so complete that you could hear the faint hum of the cameras. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet, resting it on his knee. The band members sat motionless, eyes fixed on Johnny. "Ed didn't mean anything by it," Johnny continued, glancing briefly at his friend. "He was just being Ed, trying to add to the bit. But that name," he trailed off, shaking his head. "That name lives in a room I don't open anymore." Ed's voice cracked when he spoke. "Johnny, I'm sorry. I didn't think." "I know," Johnny said, cutting him off gently. "I know you didn't." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny stood up again, this time walking toward the edge of the stage where the audience sat in shadows. He stopped at the top of the steps leading down into the crowd, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed in a way that somehow made him seem more exposed, not less. "When my father died," Johnny said, his voice steady but quiet, "I was here, taping a show. I got the call during a commercial break, and I kept going. Because that's what you do, right? The show goes on. The audience paid for tickets. The sponsors bought airtime. You keep going." He paused, looking out at the faces in the front row. "But what I didn't know then, what I'm only starting to understand now, is that some things don't get buried. They just wait. They wait for a moment like this, when you're not expecting it, and then they come back. And you have to decide if you're going to let them destroy you, or if you're finally going to look at them. The audience was completely silent. A woman in the third row had tears streaming down her face. A man near the aisle leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening like his life depended on it. Johnny turned back toward Ed, who was still sitting in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. Ed's been my friend for almost 30 years. He's been there for every high, every low, every stupid decision I've made. And tonight, he reminded me of something I've been trying to forget. But maybe. Johnny's voice caught, just for a second. Maybe I needed to be reminded. Ed stood up, his eyes red. He walked over to Johnny and put a hand on his shoulder. The two men stood there, side by side, under the studio lights, and for a moment, it wasn't a television show anymore. It was just two old friends, standing in front of 15 million people, trying to hold each other up. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, the creases worn soft from years of being opened and closed. He held it up for the audience to see, though no one could read what was written on it from where they sat. "This," Johnny said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is a letter my father wrote me. I found it in his things after he died. My sister sent it to me and I couldn't read it. Not then. I put it in my pocket, and I carried it with me every single day for 6 years. And I still haven't opened it." The audience gasped softly. Ed stared at the letter, his mouth slightly open. "I don't know what it says," Johnny continued. "Maybe it's an apology. Maybe it's more of the same criticism. Maybe it's nothing at all. But I've carried it with me every single day because... I don't know. Maybe because as long as I don't open it, there's still a chance it says what I've always wanted to hear." He looked down at the letter in his hands, his thumb running over the edge of the paper. The camera zoomed in slightly, catching every flicker of emotion on his face. "But tonight," Ed said his name. "And for the first time in a long time, I thought, maybe it's time to open the door." The silence that followed was profound. No one moved. No one breathed. Doc Severinson's hand hovered over his trumpet, but he didn't lift it. The audience sat frozen, their eyes locked on Johnny Carson as he stood on the edge of the stage, holding a letter he'd carried for 6 years but never opened. And then, slowly, Johnny unfolded the paper. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, the sound of the paper crinkling amplified in the silence. He looked down at the handwriting. His father's handwriting, and for a moment, his face was unreadable. Then, something shifted. His jaw unclenched. His shoulders dropped. And when he looked back up at the audience, his eyes were wet. "It says..." Johnny's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "It says, John, I don't know how to say this, so I'll just say it. I'm proud of you. I don't understand your world, and I never will. But I see what you've built, and I see how people love you. And I wish I had told you sooner that you were right to leave. You were always meant for something bigger than what I could give you. I'm sorry I never said it. Love, Dad." The audience erupted. Not in applause, not yet, but in a collective gasp that seemed to come from every corner of the studio at once. And then, slowly, the applause began. It started in the back rows and moved forward like a wave, building in intensity until the entire studio was on its feet. People were crying openly. Ed McMahon's face was buried in his hands. Doc Severinson stood up from the bandstand, his trumpet resting at his side, his eyes glistening. Johnny folded the letter carefully and put it back in his pocket. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, took a deep breath, and smiled, not the polished, professional smile he wore every night, but something softer, more real. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the applause. "Thank you. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten." The show didn't continue that night. Johnny walked off stage, Ed following close behind, and the audience was left sitting in their seats, still applauding, still wiping their eyes. The cameras cut to commercial, and when they came back, Johnny was sitting behind his desk again, his composure restored, his mask back in place. But something had changed. You could see it in his eyes, a lightness that hadn't been there before. In the days that followed, that letter never left Johnny's pocket. And when he retired 3 years later, he had it framed and placed in his study, not hidden away, but visible. A reminder that some doors, once opened, can finally let the light in. Ed McMahon said later that it was the only time in 30 years he ever saw Johnny cry on camera. But more than that, it was the only time he ever saw Johnny forgive his father. And maybe, in that moment, forgive himself. The name was never forbidden again.